Good morning, everyone. Thank you for getting up early and coming to listen to a continuation of a conversation that we had a few days ago, sponsored by 1PointFive. And we want to continue to talk about the skills that are necessary in the green transition, with a particular emphasis on critical raw materials and what it's going to take to get all of those minerals such as cobalt, lithium, more common ones like copper, and get those out of the ground and into the technology that we need to assist with the green transition. I'm going to set the stage just a little bit by introducing some future scenarios that have just come hot off the press from the International Raw Materials Observatory. This is their second set of scenarios. The first one were set for 2030, and this set is for 2050. And just as you watch the slides, we'll get the slide thing figured out yet. So you can take a look at the slides if you like. They'll be, part of the record here, but just to know that what INTRA has done is a very extensive amount of outreach to professionals around the world to try to determine, with what happens in the world, what does that mean for mining and for extraction of critical raw materials? And so it's designed to give folks an idea of what the future might look like so that they can start to plan, because mining is a decades-long operation. It takes skills of a nearly infinite amount and variety. And so with these, we go, anywhere from, what happens if the nations isolate themselves, right? If they put up walls and they cannot communicate and share with one another. And then all the way through to what happens if we have everyone working collaboratively. What does that look like? And I just share this very quickly, and you can go back and take a look at the actual scenarios, that are identified in these slides. But what I want to do to set the stage for you all is to know that this is a global endeavor. And because of that, we not only need skill sets in the technological fields, in the scientific fields, but we also need them in the political sphere and in the communication sphere, etc. And so as we discuss today, we're going to give everybody an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I realized that I got into this and did not introduce myself. So I will, now that I've set the stage for everyone, to talk about this large variety of skill sets and how we might actually, make sure we have the folks that we need to get the job done. I'm Maureen Gallagher. I'm the Global Ambassador for the European Federation of Geologists. I am actually an ecologist by training and over 30 years of experience in that field. And in that time, I came to understand just how important understanding geology is, because everything we do starts with geology, because that is the study of the earth. And so I spend my free time at trying to get the word out about the importance of geology and geosciences as a career field to go into, as a field of study, and having folks with those skill sets in the conversations for everything with respect to the green transition. I'm going to pass the microphone to David Govoni next, and we can switch the slides, Lindy.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Govoni. I'm from Italy. I'm the president of European Federation of Geologists. and I am a geologist as background, and I have about 20 years experience in mining industry. So should I talk or we continue into the show? So what I want to share with you today is a very practical example of our experience at European Federation of Geologists about the mapping on know-how in critical minerals. From our position in the Federation, we were asked by several stakeholders, public and private stakeholders, to get names, references about people working in critical minerals, because this is something in Europe now is growing, this industry, and we need people to do the job. And we don't know how to track, how to find those people. And so from this very practical experience, a practical need, we started with the idea of trying to map the know-how, starting from our, let's say, our members, so from the geological part. And I'm totally aware that geologists are not the only one in this big supply chain, but we started from, let's say, from the base and from the population that we are with. And so what we already have, we have a title called the European Geotitle for the geologist with certain characteristics. So we started from our, let's say, own database, and then we try to let's say, create a frame of the competencies needed in critical minerals industry. That was not easy and probably will not be perfect. So it's something like a starting point, but we try to identify the different, let's say, set of skills. Okay, the slide doesn't change, but okay, here. So we tried to identify if it is technical, financial, ESG, UNFC. So let's say the very basic experience, a very basic field of experience. And from that, we moved, are you working in exploration, extraction, processing, recycling? So try to, for every sector to identify in which area of competency of work the person could work in critical minerals. And this is, I mean, the very basic, but this is also the same type of information that European Commission is looking for. So we try to be consistent with what was the public need, the public request. And I mean, this is not been launched yet, so this is really the first time I'm speaking about, because next week we will have a meeting in Brussels, our council meeting, and we will present this project and this idea to our members. But I really hope with this schematic and with this system, we can somehow offer a practical solution. So let's say answer to the needs that we see from our stakeholders. That's okay.
Thank you, David. Bianca, would you like to introduce yourself and
Sure.
say a few words?
So I'm Bianca Daria Neumann. I am the chair of the youth group of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's Expert Group on Resource Management. It's a very long name. The acronym is even worse. It's UNECE EGRM RMYMG. We are a group of about 60 young people with very diverse backgrounds who work on or who influence or provide input for the development of a resource classification tool by the UN. But we don't only do that, we also work on other projects related to critical minerals, hydrogen, or in general demand side measures on how to reduce this or how to overcome this challenge of the increasing demand of critical minerals and the injustices related to them. I will leave it there for now because it's just a quick introduction, but I can tell you more about our work later. Oh.
Great to be here, and thanks so much for joining if you're viewing at home or in the audience today. My name is Matthias Milbau. I'm the co-founder and COO of 1PointFive. We are a climate advisory as well as a climate training company. On the climate advisory side, we advise companies to help them decarbonize. We set climate strategies, measure emissions, and then reduce those emissions in sectors like energy, industrials, consumer goods, and finance. And on the training side, we have a flagship program called the 1.5 Academy, which is an 8-week cohort-based program focused on net zero from start to finish, focusing on developing key sustainability management skills. To date, we launched it in February last year. We've had 6 cohorts with around 800 people graduating across that period of time, across around 50 countries. So I'm really happy to be here, especially on Education and Skills Day, the first time this type of thematic has come through on COP29. So I hope this discussion today is going to cover a lot of how can we get better with skills, how can we develop our economies, and how can we also give opportunities for people to build their potential in areas like critical minerals, mining, and the broader energy transition as well. I'll pass it back to you, Maureen. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, so we do have one other member who I think is hung up in traffic. And if Ian arrives, then we will fill the last seat, but we're going to continue to move on. And we will welcome Ian when he gets here. I'll go ahead and ask an initial question. And then if we have anyone in the audience or online that wants to ask a question, then, we want to keep the conversation going. And so my initial question for the group is I think one of the greatest advantages of the pandemic, right? Trying to find that silver lining of the pandemic is how well the world came together and figured out the technology and the ease of communicating, via their chosen video conferencing system, right? And from that came just a wealth of opportunity for online learning, for the 1.5 Academy, for the EFG Academy, right? So there's just an abundance. So my question to the group is what thoughts or advice would you have to those either that are just coming into this type of work, or maybe those like me that have been doing this for many, many years and, want to start to learn more along, the climate, as you say, climate training line, right? So how do you choose?
Okay, well, maybe I'll start off with some context setting as well. I think to answer that question really quickly, the choices are immense in this space. There's the biggest opportunity to build a career in climate, developing green skills, which is fantastic. Just to share some LinkedIn data from 2023 to 2024, we had an increase in share of talent required for green skills of about 11.6%. And the share of actual green talent increased by only 5.6%. And we see this propagating green skills gap doubling by 2050 as well. And why is this important? Well, when we think about the energy transition and critical minerals being a component of that, we talk a lot about the finance levers, the policy levers, the technology or solutions levers as well. But when we're talking about implementation, a lot of this work will actually be done by people like you and me in the room here. And so thinking about the skills component really brings in the human capital and people part of this. Now, how can you position yourself if you're looking to get involved in climate? Well, there are about 10 skills that are really important for sustainability management. So that's fairly broad, working within an organization, working on sustainability. And they're bucketed into 3 distinct areas: broad climate fluency, specialized business skills applied into sustainability, and then technical skills as well, right? And then there's, sector specific versions of those that make sense in that context. In critical minerals, that might be more technical skills around mining, understanding the duration and life of mine remediation plans, for example. And so what we actually see is there is a decoupling of what academia can produce and what is available out there through online digital skills learning. And that's really fascinating because we're seeing this energy transition pace that's required not matching up to where we are at the moment. And this is propagating in things like the skills gap that I mentioned earlier. So the opportunity here is actually to lean into these skills development programs that are separate from academia, right? And the main reason why this is important in academia, you've graduated from a 4-year bachelor's degree. Because sustainability is changing so rapidly, the first year, the second year that you've taken in that knowledge of your first 2 years are now out of date with what is happening in energy and sustainability. Now, I'm not saying that academic education is not important. There are some critical skills that underlie that, like STEM skills, for example. But in order to keep up with the pace, we need to use a sort of this and approach, right? Being able to enhance education with focusing on targeted skills not only benefits our academic sort of pipelines, but also people that have finished academia and are not going to re-enter universities, right? This allows us to also focus people that are not interested in degrees as well, non-degree pathways too, right? And so now if you focus on the skills and we decouple it away from, okay, I need this degree to get to this type of role, but rather we have this more adaptive approach using skills, the ability to acquire new skills opens up more opportunities as well. It also allows you to go out and learn those skills in a much quicker fashion. Think about the tech industry and being agile and iterating over your career, for example. So I'll pause there, but hopefully that sets the scene a little bit for how people can get involved.
I completely agree with everything you said.
But
No, but, and I can give another perspective on it, which is maybe a bit more personalized, because it's one thing to see what's needed out there, but it's difficult to put everyone in the jobs that are just needed. But it's also important to have people who want to do these jobs and feel like they have the resources to do so. And then, for example, when we talk about the just transition, it's always a challenge to have a big number, a workforce working in one field. It's difficult to like just re-educate them and tell them to work in a different field that they're maybe not passionate about. So what I would especially recommend younger people who are in their early career is to, yes, also look at what's needed, but also start with yourself. What's your passion? What are you good at? What do you like? And then 9 out of 10 cases, I'm very convinced that there will be a connection to climate change. There will be a connection even to critical minerals. I'm not a technical person. I don't have a geoscience background. My background is in economics and politics. And I studied that because I've always been a policy person. I've always been very interested in the connectedness of economics and human rights violations, for example. So it didn't take me a long time to see that when I look at mining is very important for renewable energy. Mining is very important for hydrogen. Mining is important for nearly every topic that we talk about here at COP. And though I am quite passionate about it now, that I understand what the links are, when I was younger, I wasn't. So I started with policy and worked my way through the topic and quickly realized, okay, there are a lot of things that need to be worked on. And when I realized that there's a lot being done in science, there's a lot being done in policy, in my case specifically, I saw that the European Union had been working on quite a few topics related to critical minerals. However, not enough. It's scaling up now. I saw the gap, and now I'm back to what you said. I saw a skills gap that I hadn't read about, but that I only saw when I was in this space. And that gap was that I felt like scientists, so academia, the industry, and also government representatives, they somewhat have similar goals, but they struggle to find a common ground and they struggle to find a language in which they can speak with each other. And that's kind of where I then started to started my career and started to develop my skills as well. Like I mapped out my skills a couple of years ago. I mapped out what I need to learn and then took those jobs that I would hope and expect me to teach these skills. And I know of your academy and the skills that you teach in your academy, I didn't find them in many of my social science university programs, for example. So I feel like a combination of education, like university education or apprenticeships also in Germany, and lifelong learning programs is for my career trajectory and for those of many people I know also a very good approach.
David?
So I would have the kind of the same advice. So it's a little philosophic, but I think you have to follow what you like. Because now, for me, I talk from an industry perspective, it's very clear the skill gap and what you need to do. And it's from, let's say, from the technical part, it's very easy to find a job also. Hello. And also it is clear, let's say, the skill gap can be tracked easily, but that it doesn't mean necessarily a person should fill uh, those gaps. And that is what I think. But on the other side, I also know that sometimes what people likes and they say what the career that they like to follow is influenced by the context in which it is. So now a lot of skills that we are looking for, a lot of jobs are in climate change industry, climate change domain. But this is also somehow influenced from the old what has been built it around. So on the other side, I think also we need to work to present and to make sure people and the younger generation especially understands what is necessary and somehow decide to make those part of their future career, but still should be a personal choice. So should not, and a person should not just try to fill a gap, which is easy to do nowadays because it's very well tracked what is known. And in the last 2 years for my company, I looked for a lot of people to recruit a lot of people, and and sometimes you find people that has a very far background from what you would expect. So in one case, I was looking for a geologist, and then okay, maybe for you the difference is not so big, but finally we went to recruit a civil engineer because just geologists were not there, but they're the willing to cover that field. That's it.
I know we have a new person on the panel, but could I just mention one framework that ties together what we're talking about here? There's a great framework called the Ikigai framework, which is a great tool that people can use if they're looking for work. Essentially, there's 4 different areas to address. So what are you passionate about? What can you get paid for? What does the world need? There's maybe one other, but if you find the intersection of those main areas there, I think you're able to find that set of trade-offs that means that you're a motivated person in the workforce, that you're doing things that the world needs, and that you're also being able to sustain yourself in a role as well. And trying to find the right balance of those, I think there's a good approach, right, that brings together maybe our discussions. Cool. So
That's okay, Matthias. Thank you for joining us. And if you would just introduce yourself, and then we are discussing the concept that coming out of the pandemic, there was just a wealth of online training and education opportunities. And what sort of advice or thoughts would you give to our audience and our online audience with respect to how do you navigate all that and how do you choose, because it could just be overwhelming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And apologies for being late. I'm sure everyone saw that they shut down part of the street. Although obviously I was the only person that was late because of that. So I'm Ian. I'm a second-year student at Harvard Business School. I'm also president of our Energy and Environment Club over there. And before coming to business school, worked in consulting for a number of years and then went to a battery startup after that before coming to business school. And I think that's a very telling point, the piece on the proliferation of different online resources for education, both in the climate space and outside of the climate space. I think the advice that I have had mainly for folks at HBS that are first years trying to learn a little bit more about the climate space is that generally pick one thing. Like the best educational resource is the one that you will actually go through. And so just pick one, try not to get overwhelmed with all of the different options. It doesn't necessarily matter if you get the absolute best one. We have HBS professors all the time trying to get people to sign up for their specific online course that they're trialing. And it's definitely overwhelming and not super helpful to go through one lesson of each of the courses. And so my advice is generally, just pick one, go through it. If it's bad, give up on it, but switch to a different one. And then I think another piece that I have noticed in business school that I had not noticed before that is there's a huge community aspect of the educational component as well. And so if there's, 3 or 4 of your friends that are also doing the same course, it increases your likelihood exponentially of actually finishing that course and taking away the key learnings because you've got other people that you're talking to. And so, yeah, I think those are probably my main takeaways.
Can I add to that?
You may.
I really want to second also your second. I want to second your second point. This community aspect has driven my passion and my knowledge in this space immensely. If we just look at COP, for example, this place is full of people from very different fields, and the learning curve I've had here is so steep. And even if we don't look at the learning curve and just look at what I was inspired by and what's driving me now to do more, to focus on other aspects, to be better. That's for me also, and for a lot of people that I know, has been a major driver. So seeking out that community, seeking out that network. Ian and I were part of a fellowship called Open Minds. This fellowship is focusing on the intersection of energy and climate. And that one workshop that we had with them also is, again, very steep learning curve. That community helps a lot. And I'm really happy to be able to get to know people that are this passionate about it.
Well, that's actually a great segue into my follow-up question, and then we're going to go to the audience for questions. But my follow-up is that I think all of us have benefited from having opportunity for extensive formal education beyond primary education. That is not the case in a lot of parts of the world, right? And particularly when we are talking about a mine, right? A mine goes in, that is a very localized, heavy impact scenario. And so, I will ask you all, what about the local people and the actual like manual labor that will be needed, maybe some of the more specific skills, who is driving that massive piece of machinery, those sorts of things. And how do we make sure that the folks in the local communities are the ones who are benefiting from, not only those sort of manual jobs, but the blue collar jobs, but also the white collar jobs. So you look like you're ready, Matthias.
I'm glad you talked about the blue collar workforce side of things. So about a month ago at New York Climate Week, we released a playbook called Stop Searching for the Sustainability Unicorn, How to Upskill a Climate Workforce. And in that, we actually covered the energy sector, finance sector, and fashion sectors, and what kind of skill challenges and opportunities they have in building out the workforce to address net zero and be part of the energy transition. Blue collar skills, when we interviewed about 30 different sustainability leaders from a lot of renewables and oil and gas organizations, they were talking about how important the trades and the blue collar workforce is in actually implementing solutions. Interestingly, in the energy transition, the same technicians that are installing solar are also the same technicians that are constructing and building data centers, right? So there's an incredible bottleneck already in our blue collar workforce with these sort of global trends that are happening around electricity and energy. Blue collar work And the technical sort of in-person learning that's requires a very different approach from a white-collar learning. I think that makes quite a lot of logical sense. There's a few different innovations that are helping the blue-collar workforce sort of development, and I'll highlight a couple. So there is approaches that are more traditional that tie in an apprenticeship type of model. In the US, this is supported by the Department of Energy. They've got a program called ITAC that has been going on for about 30 years, where they partner with universities like Texas A&M, but also work with trade schools and union colleges as well, where they're focusing on various energy type of projects as well as specific upskilling opportunities there. And we see that in the blue collar workforce, this very applied learning on hands-on learning is incredibly important for people to actually be able to do the work. We also, oops, sorry, just went quiet for a second. We also see that certifications in this space are there, but are maybe not fit for purpose at the moment. So there's a big bottleneck here where you need to be certified as, for example, a solar technician. And this bottleneck takes roughly about 2 years for you to be certified in that space as well. So from that perspective, we also at a systems level need to figure out how do we retool our certification process and streamline it such that we can reduce that as a bottleneck. Part of this is scale. How do you reach a large amount of people, especially in hard to access areas, to drive local education? There's a really interesting organization called Interplay that have just been, they've just had a round funded by Goldman Sachs and a large private equity fund. They're actually focusing on an AI and VR, virtual reality sort of way of upskilling technical skills. How this works is using simulations so people can actually interact with models that show how do things work in practice, what happens when things go wrong in a really sort of safe sandbox environment as well. And whilst this is still a growth equity sort of play, so they're not a public company yet, they're still developing their IP. They've trained something like 30,000 people in the US so far. So there's on the horizon some technology improvements and enhancements that could help with reaching local people on the ground. And I'll just finish with one example. So in our academy, we really focus on technical skills, of which some of that includes carbon accounting, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. We've interviewed people. I've interviewed an individual from Uganda, and he's talked about wanting to get involved with carbon projects in his area. They have the second largest rainforest where he lives, but he's not able to access any of the education around climate that gives him an understanding of the language of climate, in this case, carbon accounting, the numbers around scope 1, 2, and 3, right? And so being able to access this global market of education and skills can really turn around this inaccessibility point that you're talking about as well. And tying that to mining communities, this is important, not just when the mine's ramping up, but also when the mine's ramping down as well, right? And they're able to still have access to jobs in the global market through upskilling opportunities, through going through a digital skills upskilling program, for example. Cool. So I'll pause there and pass it to someone else.
So I will see from another perspective. So you mentioned this kind of technical education in countries like in Africa or other regions. I think at the moment, a lot of those skills are developed by big mining companies or companies that work on site and develop the skills and the know-how for their own operations. And most of the people that is educated or acquire those skills are the people working for these companies. And I don't think there is a really a strong education, strong schools on that can transfer those skills in those regions. And I'm not even totally sure you can do online. So, or you can do with that, because we are really talking in many cases about know-how transfer, and this type of know-how transfer it is difficult to do without a direct contact with the people already operating or at least it is difficult to do in those contexts. There are in US, also in Europe now, for a lot of these machineries, you use a sort of virtual environment, and you have some containers that simulate the type of machineries that the people learn on this type of machinery. But this type of education is very expensive, and cannot be a mass education, can be not done for a large group of people. So I don't have a solution, but I think it is something that really require investment, probably public investment, to really upskills a large number of technicians on those practical skills in region. So probably should be some kind of big funded projects to be able to cover those skill gap.
Ian?
And I think one thing, just building off of that on the public investment to cover the skill gaps, I think one thing that, so we authored a report when I was at BCG on job creation across a bunch of the different industries that are being supported by the IRA. And I think one thing that a lot of big renewables project developers, et cetera, don't necessarily advertise / have a plan in place to address when they move into an oil and gas or coal mining community is that most renewable energy projects do require fewer labor hours than existing oil and gas projects, often with different salary bands, because oil and gas jobs are well paying for a lot of these communities. And so coming in with a plan for retraining / finding roles for the existing workforce in the community, I think is very important. And there are areas where there's a lot of easy skill translation, such as carbon sequestration and geothermal. But I think a lot of these project developers, a lot of folks generally come in just thinking that the community will support a project because you're decreasing particulates in the air and things of that nature, without accounting for what the labor force looks like for a renewables project versus an oil and gas project, and just bringing additional awareness to that as folks come into communities.
Fabulous. Did you have something else, Matthias, that you wanted to add? I just want to, before we move on, I want to make sure you have a chance to.
Sure. And then I'll make sure that it's not just me talking. So I think the discussion around how do you mentioned, David, it's hard to scale that type of in-person education. That's incredibly true. But I think there's some good case studies where that has been done to an extent. So the IRA and funding around battery plants in Georgia, in the US, for example. I was reading a great case study where they had these battery plants set up and needed a lot of training coming through. What the people at these plants did was work directly with a lot of the OEMs and how those batteries needed to be assembled, right? Because they're replicating that battery manufacturing capability in the US. So they worked with companies like Samsung, for example, and interrogated their processes, understood exactly how this was done in Korea, and then replicated that in the US as well. And so I think it's difficult to scale, but when it is working well, it is fantastic. But the work that you need to do to actually scale it is that knowledge transfer, that collaboration between what you're learning and what is actually relevant in industry. And I think this also ties back to the broader sustainability skills gap that we are talking. You know, if people have the skills, but they're not able to apply it, I don't think that means that they have the skill, right? So they have skill potential. In order for them to reach that potential, it has to be relevant to a use case that, you know, broadly links to these goals that we have around sustainability or the energy transition or critical minerals, for example.
Fantastic. Anyone have any other things to add? All right. Does anyone from the audience have a question that they would like to ask? Because we'd like to hear them. Glenn?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's Glenn Ripperman from the Clean Resource Innovation Network. So you did a really nice job, I think, of describing the skills gap and the talent gap as we look at the energy future and, you know, moving to net zero, and the importance of micro credentialing, I'll call that, and continuous learning, because the legacy academic programs don't necessarily provide the skills that people will need. I mean, there's the base level skills, but not the detailed technical skills moving forward. And so there's that continuous learning component that's needed. I wonder if you could speak potentially to the challenges around the course delivery, like who's providing the training for these micro credentials, and is there a gap there? And just wondering, so sort of flipping it around, and just wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, great question. So in terms of micro credentials, it depends on, there's many different micro credentials out there. There's, I guess, the MOOC sort of world, and that's Udemy, Coursera, and those micro credentials are, generally coming from universities, right? And so universities, I guess, they're tenured professors, for example, that are doing research and then teaching as a part of that obligation or part of their contract. And there's other people that are adjunct professors, for example, that are bringing in their industry experience and teaching that in the classroom. Those courses that are set up with some built-in credibility tied to the brand of the university, they're great for, I guess, getting a cursory understanding of a topic. But the delivery, which is, intended for a large digital scaled up audience, doesn't have the same efficacy of completion rates, right? That a more tailored micro credential might be. So completion rates for Coursera and Udemy and LinkedIn Learning, for example, are in the sort of low single digits, for example, right? And so you need to bring in things like the cohort-based peer learning, for example, that increases efficacy to, maybe 50, 60%. There's some work being brought in around AI tools, for example, to help with answering questions like an AI tutor would, but also providing encouragement. There's a pilot that I know about going on with ADOS Global. They're an Argentinian, Uruguayan-based training company. They have 3 million learners that they teach. They work with a lot of the large tech companies like Microsoft, and they're currently doing a pilot with Microsoft to launch an AI tutor there. It also helps to address some of the social sort of needs of learners as well, right? Encouragement, support, so a little bit of therapy maybe. So this is sort of another approach there. And then there's these other micro credentials that we see in the climate space. So Terra.do is a platform. It's like a LMS or learning management system. They aggregate different micro credential topics. They'll have experts coming from those different areas, for example, carbon removal to nature-based solutions, for example, and you're able to sign up for a course for 6 weeks, for example. And then you have the course that we do, 1.5 Academy, and that's practitioners. We have an advisory side of the business, the consulting side. So we're working directly with industry on those projects and also going through that net zero pathway on the project side. We're then aggregating those insights and then putting that into content as well. So I think the main thing that we're talking about here is how can we reduce the gap between the practitioner insight and the learner as well? And how do we nurture that dynamic and relationship in a learning environment that is able to be scaled to a large amount of people as well? So just a couple thoughts to your question. Anyone else want to share their thoughts?
I could share my thoughts on it. So at RMYMG, we conducted a multi-perspective study on the challenges and drivers of intergenerational collaboration in the critical minerals industry. And there we really looked at the governance, people working in the governance aspect of critical minerals in the industry, in academia, but we also looked at civil society. And there we asked younger and a little bit older people what they perceive to be the biggest drivers or challenges to knowledge transfer between the generations. And we found out that a lack of ideas or education and technology access are not the biggest perceived drivers. What they really lack are, or what they really suffer from are very steep hierarchies. So they say that in the educational context, for example, they've profited a lot from professors who were very collaborative, who would go on one-on-one meetings or even provided some mentorship opportunities that really accelerated the skills and careers of the youth that that we interviewed. And then again, coming back to the point that Ian and I raised earlier, is that they say the biggest driver for them was a supportive environment, privately at home, but also academically and in their jobs. So that was also another very relevant thing. I know that it doesn't count as micro credential, but it's a micro driver, maybe. And then one of the big things, of course, that we also talked about are financial resources that a lot of people are lacking. And that really depends on the country that people are from. I know that some countries have have an educational system in which it's very relevant where you come from, and also the university that you go to is determining your career. Not 100%, but I've seen it in the space that it just really, some universities are really good at equipping you with the skills for the energy transition, for the industry, and then others. And I won't say that the German university system is bad, because I do support it. I do think that having a system in which all universities are public creates a more just education system. However, it is important to then, in order to stay competitive, it is important to provide other drivers that help the workforce to be competitive with the global workforce and global competition. Just as a little addition.
David?
Yes, it's not really strictly related, but I got in mind that I want to mention that is mentoring that is also important. And I've seen so EFG is doing, he has a mentoring program since many years, but finally there are not too many people asking for mentoring, and there are not so many people as a consequence also willing to mentor. But wherever it happened, it has been very successful. And so I think this is probably a model we should some promote more, because it really helps the know-how transfer, and also helps who is younger and enter, not necessarily younger, but let's say as a less experience in a specific field, to enter in the field. So I often say, okay, mentoring is not just for the early career that enter in the job environment, but also, I don't know, I work in carbonate industry and I move to metals industry. So someone can drive you through the change from one sector to the other sector. So this type of mentoring is very important, I think.
Ian?
Maybe I'll just add a quick anecdote onto this. So back when I spent a little bit of time in venture capital, and we were doing a diligence on a solar installation software company. And so I joined a Facebook group for solar installers to talk to people and get some interviews and survey responses from the people actually going on top of roofs and installing solar panels. And I think one of the things that stood out to me was the sense of pride that they had in the certification that they had that allowed them to be solar installers. To the point where they almost tried to kick me out of the group. Admittedly, my post maybe felt a little bit like spam, because I said, hey, offering $100 for an hour-long interview to get an understanding of what your key pain points are in the space. But I think fostering that sense of pride around the credentialing was something that made for a relatively strong community within that specific Facebook group.
That's great. Thank you. All right, we have about 9 minutes left in our session, and I want to get to another question from the audience, but I want to make sure that I can get this last question in before we run out of time, because it's a great opportunity. You know, you all have the mic right now, and as Matthias first said when he gave his opening remarks, this is the first time that these types of conversations, these topics have really been highlighted at COP. You know, we have a day dedicated to it, right? And so I would like to hear from each of you, you know, what would you tell the decision makers specifically, right? If only our entire audience, and we love our audience, but if all of the decision makers, the negotiators, if they were all sitting here, what would you tell them that they need to be doing in order to move all of this forward, right? I mean, there are a lot of opportunities out there, but how do we educate them in moving from opportunity to impact?
The first thing I would tell them to consider is to integrate skills targets into NDCs. We can then integrate this skills discussion tied to our ambition that's required. An example here is the tripling of renewables target that was launched last year at COP28 in Dubai. Right now, the Global Solar Council is putting together a standard that ties this tripling renewables target to the education that's required. We need to tie those two together. Standards are a great approach to deploying learning in a very standardized and structured way at scale. So that's probably my request for them to consider.
I'll make one request and I will ask, you said NDCs?
Yeah, so nationally determined contributions.
Okay,
for
so if
those
we
playing
can,
at home.
yeah, explain the acronyms.
Yeah, nationally determined contributions. This is the goal setting that's been done at the country level. We've just had the UK last week declare an 81% emissions reduction target by 2035 based on the 1990 baseline of emissions, which is probably one of the most ambitious of NDCs so far. Brazil, I think, increased theirs from about 56% to 67% emissions as well, which is a sign of some initial leadership from them ahead of COP30.
I would probably ask them to take a very holistic approach in solving the crisis by putting the human well-being into the center of all policies and all discussions and all agreements. And what I would then expect to see is a broader set of policies that can solve our problems. And one thing that has not been included yet, and in my opinion is a low-hanging fruit, is that we can also create some demand-side measures to tackle this challenge of limited critical minerals for unlimited energy. Not everywhere, of course, because consumption is a driver of wealth, and a lot of countries in this world deserve to profit of the resource richness that they have, and also create a wealth that other nations have been, or other societies have been living in for decades. But there is a potential in some nudging behavioral policy. There is a potential in creating behavioral policies that nudge people into more responsible consumption behavior. And that, for me, I think is a very low-hanging fruit that might accelerate finding a solution and delay the point in which we don't know what to do.
I would ask to invest more on education, and I will make a case, the case of a Critical Raw Material Act in Europe. One of the observation on that piece of legislation that are missing funds dedicated to education, and that was one of the observation of EFG. And what is good is that some of the countries that at national level implemented that piece of legislation added the funds for education, but that was not the case in the original text. So, and that maybe can be applied in any country, also outside Europe. So investing in education is really something important to cover the skill gap and everything we discussed.
I'm going to make 2 points, one related to the topic and one broader. Completely agree on the investing in education point. I think one thing that could be done with relatively low lift, I hope, is in the US, rethinking how climate science, et cetera, is integrated into education at the high school level and even earlier. For instance, I know that when I was in high school, AP, which is the advanced placement kind of college level high school tracks, AP Environmental Science was kind of the joke AP. It was the easiest one to get a 5 in. And so revamping that curriculum, adding additional pieces into the curriculum so that it's seen as like a more serious career path and not the easy alternative to AP biology is one thing that's hopefully an easy lift. And then, and that's a very US focused perspective, but I think the point probably applies more broadly around the world. And then secondly, I think more realistic target setting. I think this is my broader point. I think the fact that the slogan of this COP is keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach is a ridiculous slogan. 1.5 is gone. And I think the fact that folks have not started saying that and setting more realistic targets leads to quite a lot of defeatism within younger people, because when you see that we're at 1.5 and all of the conversation is around how everything above 1.5 is doomsday, I think it leads to a slightly disheartening scenario where one of the things that you're seeing at HBS, for instance, is a lot of people saying, you know, we're kind of screwed anyway. So what's the point of working on it? And so just setting a more realistic target, I think is something that will come in future COPs and I think needs to be accelerated.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for that. I will say, Ian, that I have a son who is currently taking the environmental science AP class, and after having taken AP physics last year, there's no comparison. So I understand what you're saying, and it would be good if it was maybe a little bit more robust. All right, we have 2 minutes left in our session, and I just want to go back to the audience to see if there's anyone who had a burning question that they've really wanted to ask. Anyone?
Hi, and thank you very much for this panel. It's been super interesting. I'm a student myself, transitioning from a job which was not green energy related into more sustainable jobs. And I have many friends that are coming to me asking the question. I think, as you discussed, there are many opportunities to upskill yourself. But at the end, the transition from a non-clean or non-green energy related job to a green energy related is hindered by many things that I think I get in school, but many people don't have the luxury to spend time and money to go back to school again. And I think my whole point is more about what I think and what I see is lacking is the mentorship. We discussed about how people can upskill themselves, but then they don't know how to approach this market. So my question is your point of view on what are the tools available and what could be done or could be improved in that area.
First recommendation would be to join a community of climate sustainability folk. There's some great ones out there. My Climate Journey, Work on Climate is fantastic as well. The second piece of advice I would suggest is explore something called Open Door Climate. It's founded by someone at EDF named Daniel Hill, and he's curated a list of thousands of people that are working already in sustainability in all these different sectors, like clean energy, for example. So part of the, I guess, energy transition, and they're available to talk about their experiences, what their life is like day to day, and provide advice. So that's a really powerful resource that you can access for free. I understand you need to get a new job and there's limitations on your budget. So there's definitely some free resources that will help your journey as well.
Anyone else want to answer that question? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we're right on schedule. So I hope you all have a great day. And I do believe that this will be shared. And so you can go back and watch it and tell your friends. And hopefully you can feel free to get in touch with any of us. We can make sure that we get information to Corinne so that if anyone has follow-up questions, we can get those answered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.